Happy Mother's Day, and happy Mother's Day to my mom who's joining us online. I'm really excited that you're here. Now, I get that today, for some of us, is an unbelievable day of celebrating our moms or celebrating motherhood in our own families. But there are some of us in this room, some of us joining us online, who just couldn't bear the idea of being together in a room today, because today, Mother's Day, is a little bright maybe because of your mom, but it's a little dark because of maybe your story. And I want to recognize and just be sympathetic to the reality that not everybody is a mom, that not everybody who wants to be a mom gets to be a mom. I want to just recognize that for some of us, the relationships with our own moms is difficult. And while we celebrate moms that are moms and nobody wants to keep that from happening, we just do want to recognize and be sensitive to the reality that there are a lot of stories. And I want you to know something, that there's a lot of ways to joy and to express joy and to celebrate motherhood around here other than just being a mom. In fact, I believe that there are people in this crowd of folks here in this room, people who are joining us online, who already understand the reality that being a spiritual parent is valuable too. And we want to recognize that those folks are everyday heroes. Everyday heroes who make a difference in the light of people. Now, can we be honest with you? There's a lot of different ways to be a parent, and there's a lot of different kinds of parents, right? There's a lot of different kinds of parents. We have, for instance, the Pinterest parent. They drive us a little nuts. You make your kids' birthday presents out of popsicle sticks and leftover paper plates, and all of a sudden we see it from the outside looking in, and it's amazing, and we don't understand how you do it. There's the super parent. You have a full-time job. You work out 2 hours a day. Somehow you have the most amazing kids whose teeth are never unbrushed. Their hair is always perfect, and you are the super parent. Hats off to you. You drive us nuts. How about this one? The pet parents. If you ever use the words fur baby in reference to some animals in your house that are yours like your own children, then you are a pet parent. Some of you are proud of that. Some of you are a little embarrassed. We get it. Either way, we love our pets. How about this one? The better parent. Now, the better parent, can I be honest with you, never has a child that's more than 6 months old, because to think of yourself as a better parent, you have to be inexperienced. And when your kid is less than 6 months, you read one book and now you've got it figured out, and your kid will never, your kid will always, your kid's never gonna, you get the idea, right? If you're a better parent, you'll get over it soon enough. The rest of us will tolerate you by next Mother's Day. How about this one? The cool parent. We all know somebody like this one. Like, we see you and your daughter or your son together, we can't figure out which one's the parent, which one's the kid, because you're the cool parent, and we don't understand it. Sometimes we look at you from the outside going, man, somebody's got to be in charge here, and some of you are like, man, I just wish I could look like that in my 40s. That's all I'm thinking. So here's the deal. There's the cool parent, but I want to tell you about the most important parent. And the most important parent may not always be a biological parent. The most important parent in anyone's life ever is the influential parent. The parent who looks at someone and says, I want to be an influence in your life. And what's crazy about the influential parent is it doesn't have to be a biological parent. We're thankful for those of you who are influential parents who have us biologically. But whether your children are yours by biology, or yours by adoption, or yours by fostering, or yours by like grafting into your family, or yours by investment in their life, like being a small group leader with our student ministry or with our Journey Kids team, however you come by parenting, however you come by being that spiritual parent in their life, we're thankful for you if you could be the influential parent. Now, there's a story in Scripture of a young man named Timothy, and we know pretty much three really solid things about Timothy. First one is that Timothy is young. It says, Paul writes to Timothy, he says, don't let anyone look down on you because you're young. Be an example to all believers in what you say, in the way you live, in the way in your love, your faith, and in your purity. That's a pretty killer verse, but Paul just reminds us that Timothy is young. The second one is that Timothy's educated. He says, study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that needs not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Paul's telling us right up front that Timothy had the capacity for higher learning, that he could study, that he could lean into God's word. He tells him to study. So he's young, he's educated, and he's gifted. This is why I remind you, Timothy, to fan into flames the spiritual gift that God's given you. That Timothy was one of those people, like a lot of us, like every one of us, young, spiritually gifted, capable of understanding, young, educated, and gifted. But you know what Timothy needed more than his youth? What Timothy needed more than his education, what Timothy needed more than his gifting, he needed someone to greatly influence his life. He needed an influential parent, and he had one. One of the first verses in Paul's writing to Timothy is in 1 Timothy 1, verse 5, and it says this: I remember your genuine faith, for you share the faith that first filled your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I know that the same faith continues strong in you. This is a pattern that we see over and over again in Scripture. Not Lois and Eunice, and my guess is there's not a lot of you naming your kids Lois and Eunice, although I bet Eunice and Lois make a comeback, because that seems to be what happens when it comes to names. We go through these cycles. But Lois and Eunice, I don't think, are currently on the menu for cool names. That's not the pattern I'm talking about. The pattern that I'm talking about is throughout Scripture is that faith is a generational story. That faith is something that's intended to be lived out in your life, but also, listen, this is so important, invested in the next generation. It's the reason why Scripture says that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Those aren't just three random characters, right? It's not just these three people. That faith, that God was known by Abraham and his son Isaac, and then by his grandson Jacob. Because Abraham not only knew it, not only understood it in his life, not only cared about it, but he passed it on to his children, to Isaac. And Isaac cared for it, knew it, grew in it, and passed it on to his son Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had faith in their story because Abraham understood how important it was to not just live it out, but to hand it down. And that's really the challenge that you and I have, whether we're moms or dads or small group leaders, aunts or uncles or friends, that as we are a spiritual parent to people, that we have a responsibility not only to live it out, to understand it for us, but to invest it into the young people in our lives, to pass it down to them so that they may know that their strong faith continues. Such a crucial piece of the story. Now listen, I'm going to ask you a question in a second here. I'm going to make a point to you that is both a little bit deep and a little bit hard to understand. This is, maybe you might think of this as profound. Like it's a deep foundational truth. And I'm going to ask it to you in the form of a question, if you don't mind. Because, I mean, not that you get a choice in the matter, because I'm talking to you and I've got the microphone and you don't. So I'm going to ask it to you in the form of a question, and I want you to think about this. But to do this, you're going to have to lean in. This isn't something you can kind of just passively think about. I just want to answer this one question. What do undiscipled children grow up to be? Discipled just means that someone passes something down to them. But what do undiscipled children grow up to be? Now, maybe you think that I'm going to give you some sort of statistic, and that statistic is going to demonstrate something important. Maybe you think I'm going to tell you that undiscipled children have a 42% likelihood of being better at their career, right? I'm not going to do that. Or maybe you think that I'm going to overstate it. I'm going to say that, that undiscipled children grow up to be criminals or murderers or something. That's not what I'm going to say. I'm not going to tell you a statistic that says that children grow up to be better at their careers or worse at their careers. I'm not going to tell you that they're going to grow up to be criminals if you don't disciple them. Or I'm not going to do something way worse than that. I'm not going to tell you that undiscipled children grow up to be cat owners. The truth is, they could own cats and be discipled, although it is a terrible tragedy. But what I'm going to tell you is something far more profound than that. And maybe you need to lean in a little closer. And I told you it was going to be deep and it was going to be really hard to understand. And all that was a lie just to get your attention. I'm going to tell you what happens to undiscipled children. They become undiscipled adults. Undiscipled children, yes, become undiscipled adults. And it's important to you that it's important that you and I understand that if we don't take on the responsibility of investing our faith story into the next generation comes and goes without the faith story. Undiscipled children become undiscipled adults. The responsibility lies with you and I, every single one of us, moms, dads, brothers and sisters, young people who are in junior high and high schoolers, college-age students and adults, every single follower of Jesus. You are all called to the exact same thing. We're called to be influential. It's really what parenting is all about, isn't it? Parenting is all about influence. It's really not about managing. It's really not about keeping them safe. It's not really just about protecting. Those are all things that we do. But the most important role that you'll have as a mom or a dad or an aunt or an uncle or a friend is to be influential in the lives of someone else. Now, I want to kind of take odds with one of the smartest people that I know that ever lived. I don't really know him, never knew him. I only know his name. And every time I hear his name, I equate it with something that's smart. Right? People have a tendency to do that. When you see this person's name, you have a tendency to say, oh, that's a smart person. Maybe you've heard the definition of insanity. It was popularized by a man named Albert Einstein. Like I told you, like I'm no Einstein. That's what people say when they think I'm not smart, or they tell me that I'm not smart. That he said that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Now, that was an Albert Einstein quote about the idea of insanity, that if we keep doing the same thing and expect something different to happen, that is insanity. But I would propose to us that maybe that's not insanity. And I don't want to argue with Albert Einstein because he's smarter than I am. I mean, not anymore. He's currently dead. But like the idea that Albert Einstein, I would know something that he doesn't, maybe that's not true. But I didn't understand what he has to say. Because there are lots of things that we do the same thing over and over and over again in consistency, and we get a different result. Maybe like investing. If you're investing in your retirement portfolio, right? And maybe you're in your 30s right now. I just want you to know something. If you're investing in a long-term strategy that's 10, 20, 30 years in the future, and you're looking at it every day, that's not the way to roll. The way to roll is to invest in a conservative long-term growth and know that if you keep doing the same thing over and over and over and over again and expecting that the result is not immediate, it's down the road, that's not insanity, that's wisdom. Same thing's true about exercise. Now, I mean, like, it doesn't make any sense for me to get up, weigh myself, get on the treadmill for 30 minutes, and then weigh myself again and decide if exercising works, right? Right. Because it's insane. What's insane is only doing it one day and then stopping it before you ever see the result. There is something about consistency that's important, and the same thing is true in parenting. In fact, it's the exact opposite of this definition of insanity. Insanity in parenting is not doing the same thing over and over and over again, day after day after day. If you want to be an influential parent, a parent that God has called you to be, or an influential aunt or uncle or friend or neighbor or small group leader, then you have to understand something, that consistency is influence. That's what influence is. It's not just a profound thing you say every once in a while. It's not just a dad talk when she's on the couch, or a mom influence. It's not just one day of putting your arm around them or spending a couple minutes. It's not one day of coming home from work early or being intentional about your time. Consistency is what influence is made of. That's crazy that we do that. I mean, it's really crazy that we don't understand it. Lois and Eunice got it. Lois and Eunice understood it. I mean, they didn't get much fame out of the deal, did they? They lived years and years and years of their life understanding faith, applying faith, and investing faith in Timothy. They got one obscure little verse, maybe a mention in a verse, and just that's all they got. I mean, as far as history is concerned, if you go down the street and you say, hey, do you know about Lois and Eunice? Not a lot of people are going to know what Lois and Eunice are, right? No, they might think you mean Laverne and Shirley or something, but Lois and Eunice are not a thing. Most people don't know about them. They're largely forgotten by history, except for the fact that they were such a big influence in Timothy's life. And that their impact on history was not fame. Their impact on history is influence. Influence in Timothy's life and the life change that happened as a result. Because Lois and Eunice understood something that not a lot of other people understand. But Lois and Eunice understood something that every one of us are called to understand. Influencers understand the value of time. The influencers understand that when I put money into an account, it might not show up this week or next week as profitable. Influencers understand that when we invest our life into somebody, that it's not going to show up next week or next month. Can I be honest with you? The most discouraging career in my mind is being a pastor. For 18 years, I worked with students before we started Journey Church. And I got to be honest with you, it's the most discouraging career you could possibly imagine. Sometimes you look at youth pastors and you're like, oh, they get to have fun and they get to go travel and they get to do this stuff. It is fun. And they do get to do some of those things. And it's a blast at times. But sometimes it's so discouraging because you invest in someone's life and then you don't see much of a product from it. I mean, only decades later, I get to see the product of some of the things that I've invested in. It was not years and years of my life of discouragement before we saw kids making good decisions, kids following Jesus, kids now, today, raising their children to know and follow Jesus because we were consistent and we knew the value of one very important word: time. Time is a tricky deal, isn't it? You don't have a lot of it. You can't save it. You can't really borrow it. You can't really scam a way around it. All you can do is spend it. It's such a unique commodity, something that's so valuable, but we waste it so quickly. Let me just illustrate it to you this way. If you have a baby that was born today, you have 936 weekends. We've got 936 marbles, and yes, for those of you who are asking, we counted them out. You've got 936 weekends. If your baby's 1 week old, it's already gone. That you can't get that week back. You can't get it back, right? If that baby's a few months old, right? You've already lost a dozen of those, right? If your baby is just a few years old, right? It gets a little more real all of a sudden, doesn't it? Just a handful of years. I don't know a better way to illustrate this than to say simply this, that when our kids are just a few years old, we lose them. A few more years old, those days go and don't come back. And yes, the truth of it is that when we spend those 936 weekends, they don't come back. Let me just challenge you with this. I'm not going to dump out 936 of these, mainly because I don't want to clean them up. But if your child is no longer a baby, your child is now 9 years old, you're down to 400 and something weekends. If your child is like my daughter, Maya, our youngest, who's graduating high school this week, I'm down to 1 weekend. Then it's gone. I'm not trying to be melodramatic, although it is a bit intense for me to feel this way. But you know what happens after graduation, right? I mean, sure, they'll be around for a little bit, right? But it'll be less and less. And then they'll come back, right? They'll come back to visit, but it'll eventually be less and less. And they'll come back for the major traditions in your life, but it'll be less and less often, won't it? Then eventually they'll have children of their own. And they'll make their own traditions, and you'll be invited to theirs. The reality is your influence never ends, although the parenting game changes. This is the reason why I illustrate it that way, is to remind us, this is so important that you and I understand. You and I get that when we spend time or when we understand how much time is left, it teaches us what the psalmist says, to number our days that we can gain a heart of wisdom. I think a heart of wisdom understands that there are a limited number of days, a limited number of weekends, maybe only a handful of vacations, a handful of time, and that you and I as influencers have to be intentional about how we spend them. Now, I promised you earlier that we wouldn't just major on being a mom or a dad, right? But I talked to you about other options. That if you're a small group leader, if you're a small group leader in our student ministry, you have about 40 weekends, 40 Wednesday nights a year that you get to spend with kids. That means that you have about 180 while they graduate high school, right? Just a couple hundred opportunities to spend with your small group while they're doing. And you know what? One weekend at a time, they go away. They're sick one weekend, you're sick one weekend. They're out of town, they go to this thing, you miss that thing. You miss those opportunities, they don't come back. We understand the value of time because that's what influencers do. You see, parenting will drive you nuts, won't it? But parenting feels like insanity, doesn't it? When we think about it, really, at the end of the day, parenting, the idea of parenting kids, feels like massive insanity. I'll tell you what it feels like. When you have toddlers at home, the idea of insanity doesn't feel like doing the same thing over and over and over again. It feels like every single day. I just keep doing it over and over and over again, and it feels like insanity. But I want you to know something. Influence isn't about insanity. Influence is about losing your marbles. It doesn't mean that you're going insane. It's about spending those one-at-a-time marbles. And if you want to be influential in your children's life, if you want to have a legacy that lives beyond just the 80 or so years that you're here, then use every marble. Lose it to something valuable. Because influencers understand the value of time, but we also understand something else. Influencers understand that there's more to time than just time itself. That there's a factor that doesn't get introduced. Is that sometimes we have to understand that time over time is what matters. In fact, that's what I mean, is that influencers understand the value of time over time. Not just spending time here and there, right? That's what we tend to do. When we understand time, we just tend to go, well, I'm going to cut out our work a little early today and spend a little time with my family. I'm going to take my kids out for something. I'm going to make time to be at a ball game. But understand something, that consistency is understanding the value of time over time. Over time is when we when we invest time over a length of time, not just showing up at a play, not just carving out a couple of minutes on the weekend, but making a consistent priority over time. That is what happens. Think about this when I just tell you these things. What about if you invested choices over time? Like you just said, I will choose to make the choices that are necessary over time to be able to be influential over time. If you made choices over time, what would happen in your parenting relationship? What would happen this one? What if you invested stories over time? Not just the stories of the glory days or the big wins in your life, but what if you invested the stories of your failures, where you messed up, where you fell short, where you made mistakes? And what if you invested those stories in your children? What if you trusted them and said, hey, you know what I did? I didn't do this so well. I made this mistake before I got married. I did this before that happened, or I made this bad choice. Our honesty about our mistakes allows us the opportunity to invest stories over time. And how about if you chose to say, I'm going to invest traditions over time? Then I'm not going to do an afterthought. We're going to choose to invest this regular rhythm, whether that's a vacation in the summer or a specific thing you cook at a holiday meal or a thing that you do. When you invest traditions over time, what happens? Your children begin to recognize it and understand it and begin to establish it as a rhythm in their life those traditions over time are important. What about priorities over time? Priorities over time is one of those valuable things that you can't not produce in your kids. Can I tell you something? There's a statistical likelihood that your kid will never play any sport 1 minute after high school. There's a good likelihood they won't even play them in high school. But you're pouring all of our time, all of your effort, all of this priority into them playing a sport that they'll probably get tired of. I was on a plane not that many years ago and all of a sudden, like a group full of young ladies got onto the plane. Young ladies and their parents. And one of the moms was in my row, and I said, "Is this like a girls' team?" She said, "Yeah, it's a girls' soccer team." And I said, "You guys are going to Vegas, huh?" "Yeah." She said, "Yeah, we're playing in a tournament." I'm like, "Wow, that's a big investment for you to keep playing, travel places like this, and put as much effort as you. That's a big deal." She said, "Yeah, we've invested between $20,000 and $30,000 a year for the last 4 or 5 years into soccer." I said, "Wow, that's insane." She said, "Yeah, it's even worse. She just told us last week that she doesn't want to play anymore. We were counting on this to take her to school." And I'm like, wow, all of that investment for priority for something that turned out to not be a priority. What I would say is, if you're going to understand time over time, the value of priorities over time, it's about consistency. I heard one of our staff people had lunch with Jonathan Robinson this week, and he said this: we may not get a ton right as parents, but our kids will not grow up wondering if Sunday is a day that we go to church. I love that. Jonathan Robinson is just a regular one of our ushers here. Elizabeth is his wife. She's pregnant now. This is an amazing stuff. We may not get a ton right as parents, but our kids will not grow up wondering if Sunday is a day when we go to church. That means something to me. What if we invested stories over time? What if we invested priorities over time? What if we invested traditions over time? What if you and I chose to make choices over time that developed faith as a primary part of our children's lives? Because here's the reality, that you and I don't get to do this again. Once those marbles are gone, you spend this weekend, it's gone. All you can do is remember it. All you can do is look back on it. You can't change it. The reality is that time over time will determine the legacy that you leave behind you. This week I came across a particular, like a little letter that was written, and I kind of reworded it because it means a lot to me. It's difficult to figure out parenting, isn't it? It's difficult to know when to let go and when to hold on. And here's what this says. It says, knowing when to hold on and when to let go is much more complicated than we think, because our kids trick us in the beginning. When they're toddlers, they hold on tight and make you think that they will never let go. So we do what every good parent does. We hold on to, right? I mean, they wander a few feet off, but they always come running back. And then they become young children. And they want you to be there for their games and their plays and the other important moments in their life. And they even pretend that they want your advice, and they pretend to believe every single thing that you say. So you keep holding on so hard because you want to lead them well and you want to guard their heart. And then sometime around middle school, right, they begin to tease you with holding on. They let you go. They let go when you're not expecting it, and they do it much more often than you think they should. They even start behaving like they think that you should let go more often than you do. But they never really tell you when you're supposed to let go and when you're supposed to hold on. You're just supposed to know somehow. And then it gets really confusing, because the complexity of decision making as a parent puts you into a daze. Somewhere along, all of a sudden, they become teenagers. And they start moving toward adulthood at warp speed, right? They start moving toward adulthood and making decisions and making choices. Then, without warning, they become teenagers and they start moving toward adulthood at warp speed. And that's when the temptation as an influencer is to panic, right? We don't want them to see it, right? But it feels like there's so much at stake in these years, and they fluster even the best of parents. For me, there was a tendency to let go when I should have held on, and there's a tendency to hold on when I should have let go. The problem is that they were born naked. You can search all the crevices and all the folds, and they don't come with instructions. You see, there's no parenting seminar, there's no textbook, there's no 24-hour counselor on call to let you know exactly when you're supposed to hold on and exactly when you're supposed to let go. So you do the only thing that you know to do. You guess, and you pray. You feel your way through every decision. Sometimes you get it right, sometimes you get it wrong. But you never stop trying to figure it out because of one simple reason. She's your daughter. He's your son. And you want to know, and you want him or her to know that you will never stop fighting for her future and for your relationship with her. Because she is your daughter. He is your son. And if we're going to understand the value of time over time and what it builds in our life isn't just time. Time over time equals influence. Use it well.